episode 13 of the Wine Tech Insiders podcast. Today, we're going to dive into wine and climate change. As always, our insiders are with us. We have Seb from Troly.
Morning.
Laurie from Oushinery.
Hi there.
Nick from Wine Owners.
Hi.
And last but not least, Jonathan from Bottlebooks.
Good evening.
So, climate change. Climate change seems even more in the news than it did last year, than it did last month. It seems like it's all over the place. Nick, is wine a kind of canary in the coal mine of climate change? Have wineries already seen changes to the climate happen? Are they going to, is it one of the first industries that could really be affected here?
Yeah, I think so. And we're seeing so much more events taking place that are unpredictable, that are causing harm to producers, that are increasingly uninsurable because insurance fees are going up so high. But I think it's also causing producers to reevaluate how they make wine, frankly. And in certain instances, such as in Bordeaux, what grapes they may be needing to think about planting in the future. And in fact, they've already started planting a whole bunch of grape varieties from further south from Portugal, native varieties to Portugal and Spain, to sort of see how they get on the Medoc Peninsula. But yeah, I think it's a problem, and I think it's particularly acute where you're looking at wine regions where domain producers or properties are relatively small, because it affects the producer disproportionately and brings the viability of their livelihood into question. So the effect of a much warmer early spring than has been typical in Burgundy, followed by your kind of typical mid to late April frosts, is obviously causing enormous damage because the plants are more advanced than they would have historically been 20 or more years ago. And clearly we're seeing a significant shift in the characteristics of the wines being made. And I think that is there's a problem, and it's also interesting. And I think speaking to wine merchants, retailers, they talk about the new classic Burgundy, which is the sort of the euphemism for the fact that Burgundy is never going to be on a consistent year in, year out basis, the sort of profile that perhaps it would have been in previous decades. So I think it's extremely challenging, and clearly I don't think Burgundians or Piedmontese or whoever have the option that Bordeaux has, which is a blended wine, to contemplate changing cepage.
Yeah.
Laurie, what about you? Have you been hearing from producers? What are some stories that you've been hearing?
So some stuff we've been hearing, because we're like a bit like later, like Oushinery comes later when it comes to like product imagery. Once typically the wine is in the bottle, so it just feels like a bit distant. That way, like we don't talk to winemaker directly. One thing we've been feeling, sometimes you can read between the line with email, is just a bit like the uncertainty. And here what's happening in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm located in Vancouver, so really close to the Okanagan region, which is the BC wine region here, but also Oregon and Washington State, where there is already, we're recording this in July, the fires started end of June already. They are massive, they're out of control. And it's just, I think some wineries, they find it almost hard to concentrate on keeping on moving when, they receive alerts on their phone. They don't know if they have to go soon. Like, it's just also like this like immediate uncertainty of like their own first livelihood and lives and belonging. And then just like this over them, like the threat of smoke damage, right? Like it's just, they already, a lot of them dealt with it last year. And this year is gearing up to be more of the same, sadly, and just like the unpredictability. So it just feels like a bit like this wariness, and at the same time, I have to say, like the resilience of it all, like just like it's they don't talk all about that. Like you can feel this like kind of like in the back of their mind, and at the same time, like life has to go on and we have to move product. And yes, the pickup truck is packed and ready to go. Even some people in my own team, like, we almost have like Slack update. It's just like, hey, we just got an alert. We may be called out to leave. If you don't see us online, it's because we're evacuating, so it's just like hanging over lives, literally.
And Jonathan, are you hearing anything from associations or what are you hearing out in the trade?
The associations are monitoring the situation. I don't think it has quite percolated up to the associations, at least on the marketing side. So I think the marketing side of the association's work is still quite focused on post-COVID or COVID mitigation measures at the moment, and that's been their primary focus. But no doubt, climate will be at the is a close second.
Yes, Seb, what about you? What are you hearing? You're probably the most in touch with wineries.
Look, a couple of things, excuse me, worth mentioning. We're already seeing, I have a number of wineries we work with in California who have already decided, just sell off, just close the business, just leave California because it's becoming untenable, right? I think there's a number of regions. It's much harder for associations, by the way, to deal with this. Because at a region level, there's not a whole lot you can do to actually just try and reverse or try and change, or you really just have to deal with the situation at hand, right? Same as the fires, when they happen, you can't just, pick up a hose by yourself and just, hose off the vineyard. It's much harder than it sounds. So there are already vineyards moving around. And the interesting question is that I think at a macro level, yeah, we're seeing some regions struggling and having challenges and not really so sure what to do about it. But we're also seeing a whole lot more of wines coming out of newer regions, cooler climates, which with the new methodologies are far more capable of producing pretty decent wines. So look, overall, the global industry will shift and readapt. I think there might be an interesting look over the next, say, 5, 10, 15 years as to the production per country, right? So right now, we obviously all know that, France, Italy, Spain are pretty much the top 3 producers in the world. Will they remain, right? Because they're all pretty much landlocked. They're all pretty much stuck in a certain area. They can't really develop much more. So I'd be curious to see how production might be shifting out of those countries, at least to a certain extent. You know what I mean? The question I would like to leave on the table is, given that we're all working with wineries or wine merchants, or how do we help the industry? How do we turn around and at the very least try and raise awareness amongst consumers, raise awareness of the fire damage and smoke damage and the challenges the industry are facing? If we are to do our bit in the climate change kind of a challenge the planet is facing, I have no intention of picking up a hose and going to hose off, fires unless it's absolutely, I think there's different skills to do that. But ultimately, the key is, what do we do today as an industry? How do we adapt to this? The vineyards are currently adapting to the fires. When there's smoke, they're going to try and mitigate. They're going to try and do different things. But how do we in the middle start raising awareness towards consumers, towards the supply chain of hey, this is really inefficient. This is really not correct. This is really not climate friendly. You know what I mean? I think that's where we need to concentrate in the immediate term.
Yeah. Yeah. A bit like Jeff Bezos or some of these other guys who are helping raise awareness of climate change by sending people into space on rockets that are burning vast amounts of fuel, right?
I thought you were suggesting you guys would send me into space. Oh crap!
we you know what? We'd love to support you on that, Seb, but it's just too expensive.
I'm just a few billions short. It's a fascinating topic, right? Because overall, it's not that straightforward to deal with. It's a worldwide problem, and I really think the newer generations. I'm taking all of us and I'm putting us into a really old group right now. But the newer generations are aware that things are changing and not a whole lot is happening, or whatever's happening is not happening fast enough. So that's a start. I think that's a start. But are we going to see, from a marketing standpoint, are we going to start seeing more sustainably produced wines? Are we going to start seeing some different wines which might have some smoke characteristics? Are we going to see wines which I'm pretty sure we're going to see new wine regions, and we're probably going to see wine regions shrinking because of the fires, for instance. Laurie mentioned Pacific Northwest. If you have a look at a map right now, mid California, all the way up to north of BC, it's all red.
Fire. Yeah.
And you're talking like, what, 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers? Right? I don't know what it is in miles, like 1,600 or whatever miles, but it's massive.
And what I was reading, which is fascinating, and sorry, the fire is now so big that it creates its own climate. Like, it's just like it takes so much that suddenly, like, the climatologist is like, well, like, it's no longer related at all to, like the usual, like the fire is so huge, creating so much heat. And I mean, I'm not an expert, like creating its own like tornado. And it's just like, now they have to study the fire itself to determine the climate of the region. Like, it's literally moving as the fire is moving. So it's just, I mean, it's quite hairy to look at. But there's a lot of unpredictability there too, like, because it really impacts on that level. It's that big of a fire. That way.
And to answer your question, David, cannery in a coal mine, absolutely.
I think so as well.
Grapes are so sensitive. I mean, strawberries are sensitive, and other fruit and berries and different things are sensitive. But grapes, given that, we ferment them, and I think the characteristics are changing drastically. So yeah, definitely cannery in a coal mine.
And I think cannery in a coal mine on a marketing standpoint as well. I mean, I was perusing in the New York Times and other publications, and I'm sure the smoke and the fire are affecting other farm businesses, right? Like beyond grapes. But the articles, were just like, again, wine is something that everyone in their daily lives know where it fits as a product, and you can like relate and understand maybe more readily than almonds, or like things like that. And it just feels it's a cannery of a coal mine. Just like, look what happened to the wineries that you are buying right now in your local liquor store. Look what like it just feels also like, I think it brings it home. I think the wine industry had that maybe a bit going for them, like maybe a bit easier to get a grasp and the impact like in the life of people. Like it's more realistic than, I don't know, canola or one of those products that we don't have at home, that, the feeding of cows down, like it's just like, it's more abstract. I think wine is strangely tangible also for people to understand the impact of climate. And I think maybe that I'm literally thinking and talking, and maybe it's an opportunity there for the wine regions as a whole. One thing I wanted to mention as well that was really clear for me last year, so like big fires again in the Pacific Northwest, and Vancouver for a while had the worst air index in the whole world, like super smoky, and yet we were, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers or miles, whatever is your unit, away from the fire. And it's just, it has no border. Like technically, there was very little fires within BC. It was all fires from California, Washington, Oregon. And you can't just say like, oh, it's an American problem. Like it stops, at like the parallel, like 39th, like, so it's just, and we all know, and, with the Paris Accord and everything like that, it's hard, right? Like, so like, it's just like to get people aligned and, so it's like this extra challenge. And yeah, I'm personally like, I try to not put my head in the sand, but I have some days that makes me very, very wary where we're going. No joking.
What about Champagne, Jonathan? I mean, could we be losing Champagne as we know it?
Well, I think Champagne could just be moving to a slightly more northern location. I mean, the UK producers have been might come out as having perfect timing with the growth of their vineyards in the UK. As things warm up, they start to have more of the conditions continue to improve for the more premium style of wine. So I think that kind of goes back to what Seb was saying, is that there's on the global scale, things will shift. It might mean that we're not calling, the 20 years down the road, the premium sparkling is, there'll still be Champagne because it's tied to the region, of course, but it might have some other highly competitive regions that is somewhat outside of its control.
Yeah, in terms of dollars, where it's impacting some of the economies. I mean, you're looking at France as being a pretty large producer. If France was going to reduce its production by 10%, right? Because there's too many regions, it's too warm. And so if France reduces by 10%, 10% of France's production is equivalent to 50% of Germany's production. And so it's huge, right? A tiny percentage point out of France, Italy, Spain is going to open up a massive opportunity for others. And we should also mention, given we're on the record, Jonathan was the very first to call that the Champagne appellation was going to be donated by the French to the English. If that ever happens, I'm buying your drink.
Being Nick, French, I don't think so.
No.
And Nick, could this do something for the market for older vintages? I mean, you could have wines that will never taste that way again.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I'm already of the view that vintages like 2010, 2016 in particular across the whole of Europe are just extraordinary vintages of balance and, relatively speaking, moderate alcohols that we're not going to see as regularly in the future. That doesn't mean that we won't see them. I suspect 2020 will be a more moderate vintage, albeit one which suffers from rather small crops, compared to the hotter vintages more recently of 2018, 19, 21 in particular, I think. But yeah, I think that those classic vintages will be increasingly sought after, along with the new areas opening up. The Grosser Gewachs and those great German dry wines that are now being produced that would have been produced maybe historically once every 5 or so years, but are now being produced every year.
Yeah.
We covered in a previous podcast what tech could do to help the frosts in France. I mean, is there really anything that tech can do? Is this just too big and too overwhelming of a problem? Are we just sort of chipping away at smaller things? Has anybody read about anything hopeful or any solutions out there that might make sense?
I think that I think that tech is it's about driving efficiencies, and those efficiencies, there is a risk that some of these efficiencies are counterproductive and not contributing to an environmentally sound solution, but many of those things are. And I think also another podcast we were talking about the just a broader effect of Corona on the digitalization of the wine industry and how wines are marketed B2B. Before COVID, everybody was traveling all around the world to market the wines, and there's a real potential for tech to support, doing more regionally or doing more things remote, where everybody is not jumping on the plane for that 1 hour meeting in London or in Hamburg or whatever, but that's, just doing things more efficiently and just not hopping in the car, not hopping in the plane for every little meeting. Of course, the big meetings, the ones that are important, there is something that's still very meaningful about getting together in person. But I think looking at ways of streamlining, does every lead that you generate, does that require you being in person? Does every new deal or catch up, does that require that? I think that's where tech can help.
And we've got, from our perspective, I think it is definitely a huge problem. And irrespective of how daunting it looks, everyone needs to try and do at least a little something somehow. And recycling is not enough anymore, right? We all know that. But ultimately, we have tried, from our perspective, I'm also in line with what Jonathan said, where technology needs to help in better efficiencies. So that productions being affected by wildfire 1 year, but fine the next year, can readapt really quickly. We've done a lot of work in Troly on two fronts. Awareness of consumers, right? So the whole idea of sustainability, we have a number of vineyards now who are operating on a net zero carbon emissions, right? Vineyards with solar panels, with Paywalls and all that stuff. And it's fine for a vineyard to install a solar panel. The problem is that most vineyard is just going to turn around and go, cool, we have a solar panel. And this information needs to permeate through marketing. And the bottles need to say this was produced in a year where the vineyard was net zero, right? To start helping raising that awareness. So we do help vineyards with the generation of stickers to put on the bottles, stuff like that. And we've also played quite extensively with the concept of price elasticity, right? I'm personally fascinated by this $19 Pinot and that $18.75 Pinot, and which one do you take as a consumer? And the idea here, we've actually extended that to trying to help vineyards understand, based on the level of production, based on the overall demand of a certain varietal, the more information we have about a product, including production volume, including acidity and sugar, the more we're able to compare different price point and kind of at least show them that, you're actually below market rates, right? So we're dealing, for instance, with a number of vineyards right now who are selling out of wine thanks to COVID. And all of them are selling their wine at the same price, or most of them are selling their wines at the same price as they did 3 or 4 years ago. And that makes no business sense, right? 4 years ago, the dollar was really different, and the bottle has been cellared for 3 more years. And so ultimately, if there's a year that they get affected by wildfires, or if there's a region that's slowly producing less and less, we need to help them understand that pricing balance based on what the industry is currently able to provide. So that's 2 areas we've actually worked quite extensively on at Troly.
Jonathan, are you seeing anybody exchanging information about being net zero?
Not net zero specifically, but this year for the Wines from Spain UK online platform, that was one of the highlights that they teased out of the winemakers and the importers on the wines, was to highlight eco bottles, lightweight bottles. since they're easier to ship,
like a thinner glass,
create less CO2. Sorry,
like the thinner glass,
the thinner
as opposed to
glass,
the thick,
exactly.
heavy glass.
Exactly. And so I thought that was really, really interesting to see that's one thing that they wanted to highlight amongst their wines. It doesn't mean that 100% of the wines were that way, but they wanted to at least allow the vineyards that were doing that to differentiate themselves. It's interesting when it raises a lot of production questions as well. I was part of a tasting earlier this year with a Sicilian winery, and they had gone into a lot of studies about how lightweight can their bottles go and not have them break. And they had been tiptoeing around what's the thinnest bottle that would accept the cork, and at what point do you have to move into a screw cap. And so it's not make it as thin as possible until it doesn't break, but it also has to do with the closure and splintering out the glass. So, but it is, there is some work going on there, and platforms that would allow producers to communicate that more consistently and have eco-friendly messages communicated, or a way to search for those wines. That I think that has some power there.
And Nick, are you seeing this? Nick, are you seeing this in logistics? Are you seeing importers talk about this, or distributors talk about this, or are they just dealing with COVID and all the other issues of 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you look at the end of the market that we serve predominantly with our software platforms, it tends to sort of be the premium wine end of the market. And we are, I guess, seeing a lot less of that. Obviously, certain producers pioneering different closures and all the rest of it. But really, where we're not really hearing much in that area. What we are hearing is how much more expensive it is to ship wine around, how tougher it is to get wines moved at all, how much time wines are sticking in warehouses in the US, waiting to find an effective way to get over to Europe. So that seems to be the big problem right now, that wine just is much tougher to move around, and the costs of moving it around have doubled.
Sorry, Seb, you were going to jump in.
I was just fascinated by Jonathan mentioning, the glass and the cork, and I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but a couple of years ago, Australia invented this thing called a screw cap. We call it a screw cap anyway. And I wonder, from a climate change perspective, I wonder how much of an argument there would be towards the screw cap being more or less environmentally friendly. Aluminum is potentially much easier to recycle. Cork, I would assume, gets recycled. Not really. It's recyclable, it's reusable, but it pretty much goes into landfill, I would assume. Can cork be composted? Yeah, I don't know. And a lot of composite corks are glued together with petroleum-based glues, I would assume. I don't know if there would be a major impact in just saying, let's just fucking abandon the cork once and for all. The industry wouldn't fly with that. Yeah, okay, fair enough. It's 10 years.
Laurie, ultimately, we're talking about, having businesses be more environmentally, climate change friendly, net zero. This is ultimately probably going to come down to a communication between the consumer and the producer, and the community. The biggest point of that communication is still that bottle and that label that they're going to see.
Yeah.
How do they there's the organic, and there's the kosher, and there's the net zero, and there's then there's the awards that they won, and then the thing, and then the whatever.
And then
how do the producers get across this kind of information? What really matters?
Yeah, the salmon safe, the B Corp, like it's just like the list.
Wild caught.
Yeah, like it's just. I mean, for me, like I'm really curious to see if this is going to redefine a bit like the idea of local. Technically, local will impact. There's less transport right there and then, but just even like, just really curious. Like. I'm like personally, I'm wondering almost if it would be like not a rating, but like you have like the debate as well. It's like, oh, is nutritional tables coming to wine? It's one of these rare products that we ingest and we don't know the nutritional value, right? It's like one of the unique things, and it's like really, really interesting to me to see if we're going to take like all these other elements. It's like, okay, so that's like the value inside the bottle, but also like the value in terms of carbon, the value in terms of like rehabilitation of land. This is the value of bringing, like the river clean and having the salmon come back again through the vineyard that they weren't before. Like, so it's just like part of a bigger picture that I think marketing wise could be interesting. And then I think will be accessible to consumers. I think I'm wary to just like put everywhere like logos, because eventually like then you have to educate about them. But at the same time, if we don't raise a sort of standard, like a way to measure, going back to data and technology, then it's suddenly just a marketing ploy. And we're, not going to just say, but like, oh, a clean wine based on what, like it's just like all like this like language. Which just like on the side, I do also a bit of wine label design still, and just work with like a winery in Washington State around Lake Chelan, and like for a small production that we call Whole Picture. And the idea is like to celebrate each wine on that particular year, what happened that made that wine. So it goes both on the winemaking, on the reality of like, it's got a bit smoke tainted because we had this fire. The winemaker felt like they just got this new amphoras delivered from Poland and they felt like trying it out. So all of it is kind of like telling the story, not in a, you need to learn everything about that to understand the wine, but like giving the idea of like all the things involved. I think the wine industry still to this day, maybe a bit too abstract when it comes to the magic behind it. And I know it's part of the magic, but I think it's time to open a bit more the kimono way to just show what it involves and get consumers more behind the scene storytelling.
Let's just leave this one here on the table. All of us around this group here probably have access to enough people in the industry for us together to define that standard, to communicate with customers. We could together create the next recycling logo for wine. Food for thought.
Food for thought, yeah.
Okay, and that was episode 13 of the Wine Tech Insiders podcast. I'd like to thank my insiders, or our insiders, Laurie from Oushinery, Nick from Wine Owners, Jonathan from Bottlebooks, and Seb from Troly. We'll see you all in a few weeks.
Thank you, guys. Love you.
Bye, thank you.